Welcome to Got Grass, conversations with the legends and leaders of bluegrass. You've enjoyed live bluegrass at Guitar Town CT concerts in Hampton, Connecticut since 2008. From Tony Rice, Rouse Stanley, and Doyle Lawson to Tim O'Brien, Sierra Hall, and Billy Strings. Now you can go behind the scenes as we chat with your favorite bluegrass stars. I'm your podcast host, Chris Worth. So my guest today on Got Grass is Max Wareham. So welcome, Max.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Nice to have you. I usually start out by asking people, if you had a day off with nothing to do, what would you do? No music.
No music.
Well, that makes it tougher.
Yeah. What would I do? Geez. What life without music? Someone once said to me, and this is a terrible musician pun, life without music would be flat.
Yeah, well, that's a good one. That's a good one. It's funny because I ask everyone the same question, and a lot of musicians say the same thing. Without my instrument around, I don't know what I would do. But then others say, oh, I'd go out driving my convertible or go fishing, or, everyone has different answers to it. But a lot of them said, I can't imagine a day without some music.
Well, I'm interested in a lot of different things in the world, so I'd have no problem keeping myself occupied. I'm really into film photography and reading and writing and going out and being in the woods and camping and getting exercise. And so, day off, I'd have no trouble finding things to do.
Yeah, you just answered the question completely. For those people who don't know you, could you just introduce yourself with a short bio for the listeners that are not familiar with you? Like, I really wasn't until I got contacted by your publicist or agent. I had heard the name, but I knew nothing about you. So I think a lot of people around here probably don't know that much of you.
Sure, yeah. So I'm a banjo player. I play in Peter Rowan's bluegrass band and have played with him for the last 3 or so years. And let's see, I do a lot of playing and teaching. I learned from Tony Trischka and Bill Keith. And I've got a solo album coming out on February 21st. It's called
Right.
Daggomit, and it was produced by Peter Rowan, and it's got an all-star band on it, great lineup. And yeah, I mean that's sort of what I'm into musically. Like I mentioned earlier, I've got lots of other interests as well, but yeah, that's who I am. I lead a band called the National Bluegrass Team, and we're touring around a fair amount this coming year, promoting the album. And I've also written a book on a banjo player named Rudy Lyle. He was from Southwest Virginia and recorded in Bill Monroe's band from the years 1949 through 1954. And he's not really as well known as he ought to be. And so writing this book was part of my interest in history and archaeology and uncovering things from the past, trying to bring Rudy Lyle's music and his significance in the bluegrass tradition to a broader audience.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking that he's probably well known to banjo nerds and bluegrass nerds and Monroe nerds, but I mean, Monroe had so many hundreds of players in his band over the years that the list kind of gets just exhausting. And so what drew you to him out of all the people you could have written a book about, Rudy?
Well, what drew me to Rudy in part was that he had a style of playing that was pretty different from Earl Scruggs, who was a contemporary of Earl's, and Don Reno, and the very earliest bluegrass banjo players. Um, he had a style that was very much within the tradition. I mean, he helped define the tradition. He recorded more with Bill Monroe than any other banjo player until the 1990s. And especially the early 50s. I mean, this is when the aesthetic scope of bluegrass was still being defined. And so anyway, he had a style that was very much within the tradition, but totally unique. And that's something that's interesting to me
Mm,
myself as a musician. How do I play traditional bluegrass and not just sound like J.D. Crowe, not just sound like Earl? Like, how is it done? And so Rudy's a great example of how it's done.
mm. How would you describe his style in terms of being different from the traditional Scruggs style banjo playing? Could you put it into words, or did you have to just listen to Rudy?
Well, I did a lot of interviews for the book, and I got to interview Sonny Osborne. Actually, it was the last interview that Sonny Osborne ever gave, and also the last interview that the great Bill Emerson ever gave.
Wow.
Were both of these interviews about Rudy Lyle, and so it was a total honor to get to speak with both of them. I mean, two
Hmm.
heroes of mine.
Hmm.
Um, what Sonny said about Rudy was that his tone was not very good compared to Earl Scruggs' tone.
Hmm.
But he had a genius quality in the way that he would play, and he described his playing as lean. It was it was only what it had to be, and he improvised a lot when he would play breaks. Somebody like Earl Scruggs, he had his break that he would play, and he would play it so perfectly and so beautifully.
Right.
But Rudy Lyle was playing from the seat of his pants. And so what resulted is this sort of, it was almost an electrifying sound. There's a lot of emotion in his playing, which to me is not to say Earl's playing isn't emotional, but Rudy's really had this in the moment quality that gave it a lot of vitality that I'm drawn to.
Yeah. It's funny because I've done a lot of these podcast interviews over the last year. They're just one after the other, talking to a lot of my musical heroes too. And I remember talking to Todd Phillips, the bass player. And I said, Todd, how has your bass playing changed over the years? He said, well, I play a lot less notes, but I try to play the right ones now. And I thought that was a pretty good answer. Like talking about lean playing. I mean, it's easy, especially with the banjo, with three fingers flying to play a lot of notes. But sometimes, a lot of banjo players play a lot of notes, and yeah, so what? It's sometimes nice to hear something that's a little leaner, I think.
Mm, absolutely.
Yeah. So as a kid, were you surrounded by bluegrass, or were you just a typical kid? You grew up in New England, or?
Yeah, I actually grew up not far from you, in Middletown, Connecticut.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, up near Wesleyan.
Yep, exactly.
Did you
Yeah.
go there?
Sorry?
Did you go to Wesleyan?
I did not. No, but
No.
I grew up spending a lot of time on campus. My
Mm.
father's a photographer,
Oh,
and he did scientific photography for Wesleyan. And so whenever I had to go home sick from school or something, I would just go to his office and hang out in the dark room. He had a little couch in there, and I would just kind of sit in the dark room. Um, so photography got kind of in my blood. Actually,
yeah.
probably literally did with all the chemicals. But in any case, no, I wasn't really surrounded by bluegrass music growing up.
Mm.
My mom played piano, and she played a lot of music for me and my sisters growing up. It wasn't bluegrass. It was more like Chopin and Bach and Joni Mitchell, and, you know, a wide variety of things, but not grass. I got into bluegrass. I moved down to New York City and was studying jazz guitar at the New School,
Mm. Mm.
and I heard a busker playing on the street, and she was playing tenor banjo.
Mhm.
I didn't know difference between a tenor and a five string at the time, but I spoke with her and I said, "You got to tell me everything about that instrument you're playing," because when I heard it, it was like, okay, that's the sound. That's what I need to pursue.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I got into the banjo and I started learning the basics about bluegrass and trying to seek out people that could tell me more about it. And I mentioned this to my mom, and she said, "Oh, well, Dad's cousin is a bluegrass musician. You should try to get in touch with him." And I said, "Oh, well, what's his name?" And she said, "Peter Rowan. You should look him up." And I didn't know who he was, but
Right.
I found my way to bluegrass without him being a part of my life. But at that point on, I sought him out, and he sort of took me under his wing, and our paths have been intertwined in that way since.
Nice. Yeah. Did you have a bluegrass banjo here? Well, you grew up playing a lot of guitar, you say, right? I've noticed, I've seen you on videos playing. You seem like almost like a natural guitar player. I'm saying, why is he playing banjo? He seems so great on guitar. He seems very fluid and like just comfortable on the guitar from what I've seen. But you just chose banjo as your main thing because why?
I don't know. I mean, guitar was such a big part of my life, and I even led a band for a few years playing playing guitar and singing lead. Um, the banjo's got that special twang,
Mm,
and it's so rhythmic.
mhm.
Guitar playing can be extremely rhythmic, you know, Clarence
Right.
White and David Grier and the cross picking and also just good rhythm guitar like Del McCurry or Peter himself. Um, but there's something about the role of the banjo that once you kind of get it in your system, you can't get it out. It's with you forever. So that's
Yeah.
the thing I love.
So when you say roll, you used to talking about ROLE or ROLL or both?
Well, that's a good clarification because actually I think both are true. I was referring to the actual like the forward roll of the banjo, the pattern of picking that you use.
Hmm.
But the role in the bluegrass band too is great. I love it. You're sort of chugging along. You're playing more notes than anybody else. So the
Yeah.
banjo player, I think, is really the person throwing the wood in the fire of the old train, or the coal. I guess it would be coal in an old train. That's really keeping the whole thing moving forward and propelling it.
Right. Right. Yeah, the role. So do you see yourself as a bluegrass historian as well as a player? It's a leading question because I'm going to ask you another one about this, but I was curious because you have written a well-known book about bluegrass history in a sense, and I didn't know if you saw yourself in that role.
I see myself as someone who's interested in history and engaging with history in a living way. Um, Archaeology is an interest of mine. I've spent
Mm.
some time on an archaeological dig excavating an old Cherokee settlement down in East Tennessee. And to me, it was a very musical experience. To me, there's no separation between actually digging in the ground and digging through the past of bluegrass music or whatever music it might be. It's kind of scratching the same itch for me. So, I mean, I don't necessarily go around thinking that I'm a historian, but I do go around thinking that I'm someone who's interested in engaging with the past and trying to share that with people.
Wow. The reason I asked you, I just interviewed last week Alice Gerard on this podcast. Now she's 90 and she had some stories. She said they used to go to Hazel Dickens' house in Baltimore back in the 60s and they would have these music parties. They would bring food and people would bring their instruments and up would show Bill Monroe with his bus would come or Ralph Stanley would come, or Doc Boggs, or Tommy Jarrell, or Ola Belle Reed, or Elizabeth Cotton. And they would all hang around and eat and play music for hours and hours and hours. And I had never heard of this, but she said, "Oh yeah, Monroe would show up on his bus, and they'd get out, and they'd all come in and just hang out and play." So I thought that would be a good topic for a book. Uh, Alice Gerard, I mean, so much I couldn't even contain. She just had so much to say, but this was all interesting stuff that I had never even heard of. You know.
It's amazing. Yeah, I actually haven't had a chance to listen to that podcast yet, but I saw it on your website, and I'm really glad that you got to speak with her because she's just she's a national treasure, really.
Yeah, and I mean, she's 90, but she sounds like she's 40. She's just complete energy and, still playing and touring and recording and talking to people. It's just I was quite inspired by her.
Yeah, yeah, that's great.
I'm going to mention a name to you or one or two and get your reaction. Ralph Stanley.
One word reaction or
Oh, you can, whatever comes to mind.
okay, Ralph. I love Ralph Stanley. I saw Ralph Stanley when I was pretty well, relatively young, and I mean it's mountain music at its best, I think. Um,
Did he play a backward roll compared to Earl Scruggs? Did he have a different style of like sequence on his fingers?
yeah, he did. It was a subtly different way of playing with the right hand. It was more it was a lot of forward roll, a lot of forward roll heavy style, and he would favor the index finger
Mm.
to play the melody, whereas Earl would use both, but was sort of a thumb lead player.
Yeah.
And well, technically, the thumb pick is plastic, and the index finger pick is metal, so it's going to have a different sound just on a kind of fundamental level.
Hmm.
But yeah, Ralph is somebody I've listened to as much as any other banjo player. I love his style.
Yeah. You mentioned Bill Keith, so he's kind of known as the father of the really melodic up and down the neck banjo style, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Bill was actually a genius.
Mm.
The way his mind worked was really incredible. He had an engineer's mind. He had
Hmm.
a way of thinking about systems that most people don't. He was really brilliant. And he was my first teacher, and he showed me so much. And coming from studying jazz guitar, he was, I think, really excited to talk with someone who had already studied jazz theory, so we could get right to the advanced stuff, at least in terms
Yeah.
of theory.
Interesting.
Um,
Interesting.
yeah. Now, as far as the melodic style goes, I don't really play much melodic style or single string style like a lot of modern banjo players do.
Hmm.
Um, I'm really interested in, it's just sort of tying back into what makes Rudy Lyle unique. How do how do I use just these roles, these traditional roles, and come up with something new? I
Mm.
mean, the possibilities are really endless. And I like, obviously, I like jazz music and I like modern styles as well as traditional. And to me, it's really artistically stimulating to try to figure out a vocabulary of playing music that's, maybe music that's more harmonically complex than just the 1, 4, and 5 chord, or coming up with my own voice on the instrument that's done by limiting the aperture of limiting the scope of what it is, saying, okay, I'm not going to try to play like Bela Fleck and use my fingers in a single string style where all of the banjo neck is now available to me. I'm going to limit it. I'm going to take things away from it and see if that allows me to create a voice on the instrument that's my own, that's unique. Um, and so while Bill Keith was a huge influence on me, I don't actually play a lot of the melodic style when I'm performing or writing or recording.
Yeah. I find it interesting. I've talked to other musicians about how your style is often determined more by your limitations than by your abilities, because obviously everybody can't play everything. So you play what you can play, and then you figure out your style based on what your strengths are and what's comfortable or interesting or challenging to you. Would you kind of agree with that as a
Oh, wholeheartedly. Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
we're living in a really interesting time for the banjo because people like Noam Pikelny and Bela and Greg List have sort of blown the lid off of it. And like
Mm,
they actually can play anything. It's incredible.
right.
And they've
True.
developed techniques for playing anything.
Mm,
And so as an artist, the question is, I think, shifting from how do I learn these techniques to play everything to what are the few things that actually really interest me
mhm.
musically, and how do I use those to develop my own voice?
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Interesting.
actually a broader cultural thing right now with the internet and globalization. And I mean, we have access to music from any country in the world at our fingertips, and it's a beautiful thing, but it's also requires a little more work for the musician or for the artist to say, okay, well then who am I?
Hmm. I guess, I mean, if the world music is your palette, you can play any kind of music from any kind of culture and any kind of history on any instrument. Like that's overwhelming. So you have to focus on something that, right? Otherwise you'd probably go insane just checking out music.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
There's no end to it.
go
Yeah.
into it. So you mentioned a little bit about Peter Rowan. So how did you actually end up in his band as a professional banjo player?
Well, my uncle Bob Wareham, um, he would host a Thanksgiving party. And so once I really got into bluegrass, he said, "Oh, well, you guys should really make sure you come to our Thanksgiving party this year." And he wouldn't say why, but it was understood that there would be a special guest. And so I met Peter there, and I mean, I was so green. I had a tenor banjo, and I didn't know that that wasn't the banjo that one uses in bluegrass. And so that's initially when I met Peter, and I got his phone number, and he said, look me up down the line. And so years passed. I studied then with Bill Keith and with Tony, and they got me into the good stuff musically.
Hmm.
And so I had it in mind that I was going to make a pilgrimage out to the West Coast to visit Peter and to learn from him. And so I had his phone number and I called him, and the phone rang, and he didn't pick up. I got his voicemail. And so I left a message. And I had it in my head. I was fixated on it. I said, this is what I'm going to do. So the next week, roughly the same time, I called him again, got his voicemail and left a message. And I said, I'm going to keep calling him every Tuesday afternoon until I get through to him.
Uh-huh.
And so I did this for months. I did it
Hmm.
for months. And hopefully it didn't bother him. I don't think it did, because one Tuesday afternoon, after calling several times, he just very casually picked up and said, "Hey, Max, how's it going?" And, we spoke like old friends. And I said, "Peter, I want to come out on make a pilgrimage, find you and learn from you." And he said, "Well, let's take a look at some dates and see if we can do that." And I mean, this was very generous of him because, like I said, I'd only met him once, and maybe he saw my insistence and saw that as a good sign, or maybe knew that I'd just keep calling until it happened.
Right.
And so I went up to the West Coast and spent about a month out there. And in addition to hanging with Peter, I sought out banjo players to learn from out there, like Keith Little, who was playing in his band at the time,
Hmm.
and Bill Evans and Avram Siegel. Um, just I was on a bluegrass quest, and yeah, I was coming from a sort of academic understanding of music. Like I said, I'd been studying music in school, and so I had a list of questions to ask Peter, and ultimately, I see now that it was a lot of things that can't be understood intellectually. I was asking him questions like, "How do you sing soulfully? How do you sing with feeling?"
Question. I mean, you'd want to know, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so he was very generous and he tried his best to answer. But ultimately he said, "Look, if you want to learn how to do this, you have to learn on the bandstand." And so again, with a lot of generosity, he started letting me sit in, for encores at some of his shows. And whenever he was passing through New England, I'd come up on stage for a couple songs, and then it would eventually be, come up on stage for a whole set. And then it would be a phone call. "Hey, can you play this festival one a year, maybe two a year?" And so it just kept growing. And Peter, I think, shaped me as a banjo player. He never really said, do this, don't do that. But through the experience of doing it, like he said, on the bandstand, I sort of got a musical sense about me and about the role of the banjo, the ROLL of the banjo,
Mhm.
how it fits in with everything else. Um, and so then we were going to record an album. He said, at a certain point, he said, "Would you like to join my band and we'll record this album?" And that was just before the pandemic. And of course, in 2020, everything got turned upside down. And so that album never happened. And he ended up writing a whole different album's worth of material. And a year later, we went into the studio in St. Paul, Minnesota, and recorded "Calling You from My Mountain." And it was, like I said, totally different material. Actually, most of it I'd never heard until we pressed record, which was a wild experience. But again, coming from jazz, I was used to
Yeah.
improvising, playing from the seat of my pants. So
Hmm. Yeah. I've seen some duo stuff with just you and Peter on stage. So what are the challenges and the rewards of playing a duo set with Peter Rowan? Like, what is that like for you?
the rewards are high. Um, and the challenges can be high depending on headspace. My friend Eric Lee, who's a fiddler down in Nashville now, there was a time where he and I were sort of following Peter around, and we'd sit in with him, and um, it was a great learning time for us both. And Eric said, when you're playing next to Peter, it's the weirdest thing, but there are no wrong notes. It's palpable. He said he could really feel that.
Mm.
And and so that's a special thing. Um, but to answer your question more directly, um, my time and my relationship with Peter have broadened my understanding of music from what it means to put on a good show to the spiritual, what it means to be here as this person called Max on this stage, connecting with people, what it means in a much broader sense. And that sense is a real purpose in life. It's a real feeling of belonging to get to connect with people in that way. So the reward of doing it, I mean, this might be a little bit broader than the scope of what you're asking, but the ultimate reward is actually spiritual fulfillment, getting to connect to people's hearts and share beauty.
Yeah. Well, that's a good answer. Thank you for that. Are you still in Peter Rowan's band, or have you left to pursue your own thing, or is it kind of still there for you?
It's
Peter,
still there for me. Yeah,
still
yeah,
there.
we're
Yeah, that's
still
good.
we're still playing maybe less than we were coming off of touring the album. And I
Hmm.
am certainly playing a lot more with my own group, promoting my own album.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, we're still working together.
I've been trying to get Peter on my podcast, but some of these older people that just are stubborn and just don't want to, he doesn't, I haven't talked to him, but I mean, his agent or whatever says, nah, no thanks, not right now. So we'll see. I would love to
I'll
talk
put
to him, but
yeah,
I'm
I'll
not.
I'll put in a good word.
So he played here in 2011. We had a tribute concert to Bill Monroe, and it was the Traveling McCourys with Peter Rowan and Tony Rice. And Tony didn't show up. He had played here a lot before Tony, but he didn't show up. But Peter came in and basically became Bill Monroe for this show with the McCourys. It was weird and amazing and almost eerie. Like he just took on. He had the hat on, the white cowboy hat, and he was singing all the Monroe songs just like Monroe sang them. It was unbelievable. He just channeled them. I know it was the craziest thing I ever saw in my life.
Wow. I wish I
Yeah,
could have been there.
yeah. Can we talk a little bit about your songwriting? I know you do write a lot of songs. Do you have a method that you stick to, or is it just what comes?
Oh, every song is totally different in terms of the process.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, a couple will take years to write, and a couple will come out in 20 minutes, and a couple will be very traditional sounding, and a few others will be more modern and you know, more of a sense of levity in the writing. No consistency at all. The only constant is change.
When you write a song and you've finished it, let's say, do you go back and tinker with it, or do you just let it be and move on?
Yeah,
How's
I
that?
do. I do. I think that editing is so important in songwriting. One of
Hmm.
my students just earlier today told me that the original version of Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah was 124 pages long.
So a good editor came in handy. It was probably him.
I think so. Yeah, he pared it down to three or four, and it's a masterpiece. It's a perfect song. But
Yeah,
I mean, that sort of illustrates it, I think.
yeah, yeah. I'm thinking about your singing voice, which is not a typical bluegrass sounding voice. As a singer, do you kind of model yourself of anybody that you've enjoyed listening to? Or do you feel like it's just the way it comes out and that's just you? Like, do you have a bluegrass singing hero?
Hmm. Well, I love Carter Stanley, and
Mm.
I love Carter because he sang kind of softly, which, these days people think that to sing bluegrass, you have to really belt it and sing as loud as you can. And I love high lonesome singing. I mean, it's a beautiful sound, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. It can still be beautiful and still be very much a part of the tradition
Mm.
if it's a little bit more dynamic. Um, and not to beat a dead horse here, but um, getting into bluegrass and getting turned on to Peter's music, I did, learn pretty much every song that he's recorded and listened to every little nuance in the voice. But it's interesting. He told me once when he was working for Bill Monroe back in the 60s, he sort of did the same thing with Bill Monroe's singing. I mean, if you listen to those early recordings, um, they recorded one album together, Bluegrass Time, but there are a bunch of live recordings for that band. And that band was
Right.
awesome. And Peter does sound a lot like Bill. I mean, when they sing together, it's eerie.
Hmm.
And at one point, after they played on the Opry, they were back in the dressing room, and Bill says to Peter, Pete, we've got a lot of letters coming in saying that you sing just like me. And Pete said, "Oh, okay." And Bill said, "Stop that. Sing like Pete.
Right.
Sing like Pete
Yeah.
Bones."
Yeah.
And
Pete Rowan.
so you emulate people, but then at a certain point, you have to let it all go and do your own thing.
Yeah. Um, Tell me about your new album. I know this is not your first album, but this seems like a pretty major project with some great, great players, some of whom have played here over the years.
Mm.
How did this come about? You just were ready to do it, and
Yeah, I was. So this is I've worked on many albums over the years. This is my first album under my own name as a banjo player, and the way I have one of the ways I've viewed these last few years touring nationally with Peter is that it's sort of like the equivalent of grad school for a musician, for a working musician. I mean, it's an education,
hmm.
and so this album is my dissertation. um,
Very
I
good.
I reached a point with it all where I said, "Yeah, I've got something to say, and I want to start saying that in a more deliberate way." And so, um, basically sat down and said, well, who's my dream band? Who are my all-time favorite musicians to listen to? And it's a funny thing. It turns out that musicians will play with you if you pay them. It's a simple thing
Right.
for the most part. And so I sat down and put a band together. It's Laura Orshaw on fiddle,
Mm-hmm.
Chris Henry on mandolin, and Chris also plays in Peter's band,
Right.
and Chris Eldridge on guitar from the Punch Brothers and Mighty Poplar. And we also got David Grier on guitar. So they're switching off. They're not both playing on the same tracks, but
Sure.
it's one or the other. The great Mike Bubb on bass,
Mm-hmm.
and Larry Atamanuik on snare drum.
Mm-hmm.
Wanted to have a drummer in the band, and it's low in the mix. It's not drum heavy, like it doesn't necessarily sound like jam grass drums necessarily, but the snare with brushes is totally part of the bluegrass tradition. It's something not a lot of folks do these days,
Right.
but it's something that the Osborne brothers, the Stanley bro. I mean, even Bill Monroe recorded with drums. It's sort of
Mm-hmm.
overlooked.
Yep.
So anyway, Larry used to play in a band called Sea Train
Mm-hmm.
with Peter, sort of psychedelic rock.
Oh yeah, I know the band very well. I grew up
Yeah,
listening to
yeah,
that. Yeah.
cool, yeah. And he also went on to play with Alison Krauss and Emmylou Harris, and he's just when Larry's in the mix, everything is okay. His
Mm-hmm.
sense of rhythm and the joy he puts into playing, it's just infectious. It's just so good. And so Peter produced the album, and he and I co-wrote a few songs on the album. He sings, I think, two cuts on the album. One that we wrote together, and the old gospel number, "Drifting Too Far from the Shore." And with this album, I wanted to do something aesthetically that's a little bit different from a lot of contemporary bluegrass that I hear these days.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I admire anyone that's putting the strap over their shoulder and going out and playing. I don't mean to say anything bad about anybody. Anyone who's doing it has my respect and my admiration. That having been said, I think there is a sort of a contemporary style that's, to me, it kind of sounds like the next thing and the last thing, and it all kind of blends together for me. Um, and people call it traditional bluegrass, but what I wanted to do with this album was to get my gloves on and do some digging and go through the tradition and find some aspects of the tradition that aren't really paid attention to these days by contemporary bluegrass musicians. So one of those was the snare drum that I mentioned, and another one was the tape echo slapback effect that Elvis popularized back in the
Sure.
50s.
Yeah.
And bluegrass followed suit. I mean, people were putting slapback on everything, especially the record label Starday, who recorded mandolin player Buzz Busby
Mm-hmm.
and the Country Gentleman, and a lot of really classic bluegrass had crazy echo on it, and it's a weird sound, but it's very beautiful, and it's something I've always been drawn to. So that's just another example of one of these qualities that I've tried to dig up and use.
Yeah. I love when Pete Warnock used to put that banjo through that phaser with Hot Eyes. That was like, oh my God, that was nothing much became of that, but that was an amazing sound that he had.
It
I
was
loved it.
amazing. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I appreciate that he was trying to broaden the scope of what we're used to hearing with the banjo.
Yeah. I see what you mean about modern bluegrass. I mean, it's become almost like it has to be this way. It has to sound this way. And if you, like you say, if you look back at Bill Monroe, we would have the accordion and the drums and the swing bass and all this stuff going on. which kind of has been lost in bluegrass. Bluegrass now is basically like straight ahead, bluegrass, which is fine. I love it. A lot of players, a lot of bands playing it, but there's a lot more to the history of the music than that. And a lot of it's just kind of fallen by the wayside because it's just become, this is what bluegrass should be.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's become
Interesting.
very standardized.
Is there anybody in the history of bluegrass that you would have enjoyed playing with or hanging out with that you didn't have a chance to?
I think I would have enjoyed playing with and hanging out with everybody that I haven't had the chance to. I love being around musicians. I love picking. Um, it makes me so happy, and I just have so much love for all the different nooks and crannies of the legacy of bluegrass. I
Hmm.
mean, I'm not sure that I could pick out some from any others, really. I mean, I just have a lot of admiration for everybody who's gone before.
Yeah. Let me put this to you. If you could have a duet with anybody around today in music, and not somebody you've played with before, but I mean, I asked this question of, say, like Rhonda Vincent, and she said, "Oh, I'd love to sing with James Taylor." Uh, so, is there anybody in the modern music world that you would say, that would be a nice fit for you?
I'd love to sing with
Oh,
Del McCurry. I mean, wouldn't that be great?
hmm. I
He's,
wouldn't think that would be too hard for you to arrange. You must know all these people pretty well.
well, Peter's band and Dell's band did a lot of the same festivals over the last few years. So
Hmm.
I have gotten to know his band, and gotten to know Dell a little bit, but we've never actually sung together. But for me, actually, speaking of Connecticut, my first bluegrass festival was Podunk,
Oh,
um,
yeah.
back when it was in East Hartford.
Yeah.
And
I remember it very well.
yeah, yeah. And so that was the first grass that I saw up close and personal. And I'll never
Mhm.
forget this because it was a life-changing moment. But there was a workshop that Del McCurry and his band were doing. It was like, I don't even remember what the workshop was on. It might have been harmony
Mm.
singing or something. But
Mhm.
this was actually the last year they had it in East Hartford, and I went alone. It was just me seeking bluegrass. I didn't know anybody there, and I went to this workshop, and I'm sitting there, and I'm thinking, oh, who are these guys in suits and ties getting their instruments out of the cases? And you know how it is with the thunderstorms in the summertime, late afternoon, you kind of see it rolling in, and it did roll in, and as they got their cases open and their instruments out, the skies just opened up and it started pouring rain. And so everyone's sort of huddled in this pavilion watching these guys about to do something. And Dell kind of, with an impish grin, looks at the rest of the band and says, "Follow my lead." And they just break right into that old rain is cold and slowly falling. And it was a life-changing moment for me.
Oh, man.
Oh, it was just so great. And so, it's sort of like a baby with its very first memories. To me, Dell is certainly one of the patriarchs of the tradition. Yeah.
Yeah. That band, just speaking of the McCrory band, I think is the tightest bluegrass band I've ever heard. When they play one note and they take off on a song, it's like just the train is going. It's amazing. There's no, I mean, I don't know what it is. There are a lot of great players in other bands, but that band seems to just click from the first note. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah. Oh, they are totally unique in that way. I mean, they're
Yeah.
they're the best at that. And I have a theory, or at least an idea that I'm working on. Now, bluegrass is very much about lineage, and Bill Monroe is the father of bluegrass. I think that the two people these days really carrying that flame, that initial soul of bluegrass music, are Del and Peter, and they represent different aspects of that flame. For me, Peter represents the emotional side of bluegrass. You know, Bill Monroe's music was extremely emotional, and it was very tender too, and it was very in the moment. It had a life energy, it had life force to it. Bill Monroe didn't write set lists, and Peter doesn't write set lists. I mean, generally speaking.
Mhm.
And so there's this sort of in the moment connecting to people's hearts, and that's the sort of part of the tradition that Peter carries. And that's a really special thing. And we're lucky to live in a time where we get to experience that and be around that. To me, Dell is carrying a different quality of that initial fire of bluegrass, and it's the perfection of form. It's like when the fiddle is playing just the right thing and the mandolin is playing just the right thing, but over here, and then the banjo is doing just the right roll here, and then Dell comes in with the perfect G run. It's like Bill Monroe's conception of bluegrass music at its most refined form. And there's nothing like it. I mean, it's just so unique. And again, to me, that's sort of the part of that initial fire of bluegrass music that Dell is sharing with the world.
Yeah,
Um, yeah.
interesting. I got into bluegrass really through Tony Rice. I didn't even know who Bill Monroe was when I first knew bluegrass. And to me, in terms of emotional playing and singing, he was the man. Like the only person I think I ever cried listening to a song was Tony Rice playing a lead on some song. It was like, how can you play something so beautiful? So to me, his whole death and stuff is kind of mysterious and weird, but he was the one who emotionally I felt, and I think I've heard this from Alison Krauss. She said I listened to his music and I just believed everything he said was coming from his heart, even though they were just songs. And
Mm,
something about his quality of his voice and maybe his whole mystique, I don't know. But
mm.
for me, it just was like, oh my God, this is like pure emotion coming out of this man.
So you had him play at your concert series, right?
Yeah, he played 4 times up here. And the first time he played here was just instrumental. He didn't have there was no singer in the band. And then Josh Williams joined and sang all the songs. Josh was playing mandolin, Ricky Simpkins and Wyatt and different
Mm,
bass players. Yeah,
mm,
it was great. I mean, he was my hero, it still is, and it was nice to be able to just kind of chat with him a little bit. He, of course, was really into jazz, and we had
mm,
similar jazz heroes, John Coltrane and Oscar Peterson. That's because I grew up listening to jazz too, like you did. So,
mhm.
yeah, it was fun. It was fun, and I heard he was a difficult person. I heard he's not going to show up, but he did. And I heard he likes lobster rolls, so we made him lobster rolls and gave him plenty of Coke, and he was the happiest man. He was just in his glory. So it was
Yeah.
a great experience. I'm very glad I got to meet him and get a little bit of him in my life. But
Oh, that's great.
yeah. Um, I was just talking to Alice Gerard about this song called "The One I Love Is Gone," which is a Bill Monroe tune that he wrote, and she said we were at a party at Hazel Dickens' house, and Bill came up and said, "Girls, I got a song for you to play. I think you'd be good at it." And so that was that song, which I like. So let's get back a little bit to playing banjo in a band. So when you're about to take a solo, what, if anything, is running through your head? Too many things to say, or just like you just go, just play?
Well, I've gone through phases with it, and I've experimented a lot with different mindsets and different mantras and different things to try
Hmm.
to play the best that I'm able to play. And you know, everybody is different, and everybody has their own thing that works for them. And after I've tried just about every positive visualization and every intention as I step up to the mic to play. Really, the only thing that works for me is to not do anything at all but play the banjo. Um, I guess it's this. idea that I guess it's tied to what people call muscle memory. Um, we tend to think of intelligence as happening up here in our heads, and certainly conceptual intelligence is happening there, our ability to think abstractly and do things with intention. But but I think our bodies have intelligence too, and I think that's what muscle memory is. And so rather than thinking, okay, I'm going to do this concept here, I'm going to think this thing, and that's going to make me play better. I just try to turn my intellectual mind off and trust my body's intelligence, trust the intelligence of my fingers to respond in the moment to what's happening and create a moment that's meaningful to me and to other people.
Yeah. So you know the song, you know the key, you know the tempo, you know all this stuff, the melody. So you're kind of just trusting yourself just to play whatever, and whatever it is, it is. You're not saying, well, I got to start
Yeah.
with this and then go to this and work up the neck to this and then put this roll in, and then you're not doing that. You just go with it.
Yeah, and when I do try to do that, when I do try to say, "Oh, I should really end this with this lick,"
Hmm.
I always it never comes out as I think it will. So I never try to do anything other than play the melody in a
Play, yeah.
it's fresh.
Yeah. When you think about your own playing and singing and musicianship, do you have perceive weaknesses in your playing or singing that you work on? Like, do you say, God, I really got to work on this part of my game here?
Yeah,
Like,
all the
can you
time.
think of one? Can you think of one just for fun, like that
Well,
you're trying to work on?
yeah, tone is a never-ending journey, especially
Oh,
for banjo players. I have been getting into taking videos of myself practicing and watching them, and I'm careful not to frame anything as a weakness, though, because
yeah,
the
probably a bad word. Just whatever, something you're trying to work on, maybe.
yeah, yeah, of course, yeah, there are always aspects of singing or playing that I'm trying to make more beautiful and trying to improve. But tone is a big one because tone is sort of elusive. Tone can be produced in a lot of different ways. Um, Tone to me is one of the most fund it's the most fundamental quality of music because at a certain point all any sound is tone. Any musical expression is a tone, and so to try to refine that tone, I mean it's really a never-ending thing, but I mean it's the really the contact between the finger and the string. It
Mhm.
comes down to that one instant where the fingers pushing on the string and then letting it snap back to produce a sound. How do I get that sound to more accurately express my experience of the world? You know,
Mm.
it's a really a never-ending thing. But speaking of
Yeah.
Tony Rice, I mean, he had such incredible tone on the guitar and also vocally too. And I think he had a very light touch too. I'm told
That's
that.
what I've heard from people. He played quietly, but he could bring it on, you know. So his normal playing was quiet. So when he had to step up a little bit, he could, but he was not a loud player. I think I heard that from Dan Tominski. He said, yeah. And people said, no, I've played Tony's guitar and it wasn't that great. Didn't sound that good. I couldn't get anything out of it. It just sounded like another whole guitar. So whatever he had, he just was able to pull out beautiful tone. I personally, I mean, I personally like his rhythm playing, and I like his soloing on kind of slow melodic songs. I mean, obviously he could play the hell out of a fast bluegrass tune, but I think when he got more sensitive and played these kind of quiet melodic solos, just beautiful. I mean, simple stuff, but
Mm,
just like nobody else could.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I heard an interview with Billy Strings a while back on YouTube, and he was saying, you know, I've been playing all my life, and I thought I sounded like this when I played, and then I heard myself recorded playing, and he said, I don't play at all like I think I play. He said, whoa, it was a real moment for him. He said, I realized that I'm not what I think I am in terms of playing. He said, I realized, wow, you you better, you know, so he said, I started studying, you know, theory because he was completely self-taught and didn't know anything really about music theory. He said, I really started learning about chords and keys and all this stuff because I realized my playing was kind of rote, but it wasn't maybe as good as I thought it was or as interesting as I thought it was until I heard it. And I said, I got to do something about it. I thought that was interesting because, he is like the big star of bluegrass right now, but he even realized that, you can always find new things to add and make yourself more musical or whatever the word might be.
Well, that's an interesting story. I think it's a universal experience for, well, for everybody. You hear a recording of yourself speaking and you say, "Oh, do I really sound like that?" But I think it's true in other aspects of our lives too. We have these
Mm-hmm.
conceptions. Oh,
Yep.
I'm some really hot shit, or "Oh, I'm so down on myself because I wish I could be better at this." And oftentimes what we think about ourselves is really not the reality, whether it's better or worse. I mean, I think it's a really powerful thing to get a little dose of well, stepping back a little bit and really taking a look at how you relate to other people and what you're made of, who you are, and growing based on that. And of course, that's musical too. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, listening to recordings of yourself playing. I've played some of the worst breaks in my life and then listened back to a recording and said, "Oh, that's actually really good. How, how is it that my perception in the moment can be so different from reality?"
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a
Yeah.
good means of growth, I think.
Yeah. Um, where do you see yourself in say 5 years? Do you have a plan, or are you just living kind of week to week, month to month? Do you have a life plan? I mean, I never did in my life, but I just thought maybe you might have one.
I've never been good at the long-term plan,
Hmm.
um, but at least career-wise, I'd like to continue writing and recording new music. Um, I'd like to continue touring and meeting people and sharing music with people. Um, Having finished this album that is coming out just around the corner now, um, I think I've proven to myself my roots in traditional bluegrass. And what's really exciting me right now is exploring songwriting that is not less rooted in tradition, but maybe less bound by tradition. Um, in my non-bluegrass life, when I'm playing fingerstyle guitar and writing songs that are not bluegrass, I really like to explore other approaches to songwriting, other forms of songs. And so, what I'd like to explore now is connecting these two disparate parts of my identity as an artist, melding them a little bit. And so, continuing to play bluegrass, but exploring maybe a little bit more deliberately what lies at some of the horizons of the music.
Um, there's a song, it's called Trip Around the Sun, written by Al Anderson, that Bronwyn Keith Hines has on her album, which is not a bluegrass song at all. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous song. Um, I think even what's his name? Jimmy Buffett might have wrote this song at one point. Al Anderson, is a local guy, Connecticut, Windsor guy. He was a huge rock
Big,
star here. Big
yeah,
Al.
Big Al, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
NR,
Wild Weeds, NRBQ.
yeah,
Yeah, that's him. And he moved to Nashville and has become one of the super writers in Nashville. Um,
right.
you know, but this song he wrote, "Trip Around the Sun," which is just another example of a beautiful song that has nothing to do with bluegrass. It's on Brownman's album, which is kind of a bluegrass album, but it's just has a very sensitive, simple. I don't know. It's just check out the song if you haven't heard it. It's a really really nice song that I
I
like.
will.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add? Our hour is up and more, and we've covered a lot of territory here. You're a very eloquent speaker about your music and your feelings, so thank you for that. Anything else you'd like
Well,
to
thank you.
put out there?
Well, I guess the only thing I'd like to mention is that if folks are interested in catching tour dates or ordering the album, It's out on CD and also on vinyl. Or in taking music lessons, I do a lot of teaching when I'm not playing. They can visit my website, which is my name, Max Wareham, WAREHAM.com. They can learn more there.
Okay. Yep.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Max, for coming on. It's been a pleasure. I've learned a lot from you, and I hope to meet you in person someday. Maybe you guys will play up here sometime. That would be fun.
I'd look forward to it. Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you, Chris, for having me. It was great talking
Thank
to
you
you.
so much. I'm gonna stop now, and good luck with everything, Max.
Thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot.
I hope you enjoyed our podcast, and thanks for listening. Visit our website, guitartownct.com, for concert and podcast schedules, or just to send us a message. We'd love to hear from you.